Thank you very much. Happy to be here, not necessarily happy this week. I must say, like Carl, I was in Pennsylvania for the election, so like Carl, I'm a little on the shocked and depressed, but not totally surprised state. But I promise not to depress you. My job is to cheer you up, because we're organizers, we've got work to do. I will say, although foreign policy was not a big part of the Trump campaign, mostly sound bites, what is worrying, and we are entering a very dangerous period, I think, because with sort of right-wing populists like Trump or others around the world, including Putin, although foreign policy isn't a primary driver of what they're doing, often they are not able to deliver their economic policies. Certainly that's the case in Russia, and I think it will be the case in the US. A little war somewhere often is nice to stir up support from the folks at home. That's dangerous. That's a tendency. We've seen this, really going back to the 30s. It's a very dangerous tendency, and I think that's a large worry that I have. Now, to cheer you up a bit, I mean, we've had a lot of right-wing presidents, as Jamie said. I've been around quite a long time. I came to Washington. I worked in the McGovern campaign as a volunteer in Cambridge. We didn't see many Nixon supporters. Came to Washington for Nixon's counter-inaugural in January of 73, an incredibly dark period. Nixon got 520 electoral votes. McGovern, our guy, the anti-war guy, got 17 electoral votes. This was a very depressing period, and we are not in a period like that right now. And again, we had not just Nixon, but after Reagan's landslide victory over Jimmy Carter, very depressing period. And we got through that. Reagan was a little more successful. Nixon, of course, 2 years after this amazing electoral landslide, he was had to resign, so that was certainly encouraging. So we've had this back and forth, and I believe that Trump, I won't say it's the last gasp of right wings in this country, but we will come through this. I'm just convinced. I mean, he doesn't have much of an electoral mandate. He did not win the popular vote. And there's a tremendous, this is not 1972, 1973. There's an incredibly well-organized and fired up sort of populist citizenry out there. And again, Trump's going to have problems with the Democrats in Congress, with the Republicans in Congress, and really with us, with the amazing number of people out on the street who will limit what and Reagan for 4 years. So, what is going to be really important, I think, is who he puts in as his foreign policy people. For instance, look at who he's going to put in for Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. If he chooses someone like Hadley, if he chooses somebody like maybe Richard Haas, certainly not our people, but they're managers. But he could pick somebody like John Bolton, who we've had a lot of experience with. John Bolton he was nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And Mort Halpern and I and a number of other people led a campaign to stop his nomination. And we did. We succeeded, although Bush, too, ended up giving in a recess appointment. But I think looking at these appointments is really important. And again, the military, Carl and others were talking about it. I am not so sure that he's going to increase the military budget. We spend already half of our discretionary budget, government spending, on the military. If he wants to slash taxes on the rich and corporations, if he wants to start a major rebuilding infrastructure program, the question is, where is the money going to come from? A big spike in military spending would result in massive deficits. And I think in some things he may cut, such as the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, which funds our wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, and he's claims to be opposed to those. So I think that one can say that Trump is more of an isolationist than a neoconservative interventionist. And his policies towards the Middle East, in some ways, I think will be no worse than what we would have gotten from Hillary Clinton, who was talking about no-fly zone, which would have been a direct confrontation with the Russians. So I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I think that it's not as bleak as perhaps we think. And certainly domestically, it's horrible, but in terms of foreign policy, it's very much an unknown. Now, what can we expect Trump to do, and how can we push back on all of that? I think that's really what we should be thinking about. Again, I'm not an economist, I'm more of an organizer and an activist, and very practical. And I think that when Jamie asked me to come here, the idea was to lay out a very positive agenda. What would a sort of good democratic foreign policy look like? Well, I threw that out the window. I think what we're talking about now is damage control, because we're not going to be moving forward on many of the issues that we care about. But again, I think that the relationship with Putin is very important. I agree with many of others. I was very worried that Hillary Clinton, who had some reason to be cross with Putin, would come in as a very, very anti-Russian, and that this was going to be a very difficult relationship. It is very much in the interest of the United States to have a partnership with the Russians and not try to confront them at every juncture. What's this mean, for instance, in Syria? I think it's likely that Trump will back away from support for the so-called moderate Syrian opposition and cut a deal with his pal Vladimir Putin. I think it's that, and that I think will lead, depressing as it may sound, to Assad getting most of his territory back. And who knows, maybe this is inevitable. I feel the Syrian people are going to have to live under a somewhat vindictive and certainly brutal dictatorship. It's going to be, it's not very positive. And Trump, the argument that Trump makes is that, as he puts it, I would treat Vladimir Putin firmly, but there's nothing that I can think of I'd rather do than have Russia friendly, as opposed to the way it is right now, so that we can go out and knock out ISIS together, along with other people and with other countries. Wouldn't it be nice if we actually got along with people? Well, wishful thinking perhaps, but the Turks and the Saudis would feel betrayed. Iran would once again, ironically, be the big winner, as it was in 2003 when Bush took out Saddam Hussein. The Kurds would be screwed once again. And again, millions of Syrians would be forced to live under an Assad regime. The other, I think, casualty of the Trump administration will be the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. In my opinion, however, that option died some years ago. And mostly talk of, when you hear politicians, at least in this country, talk of a two-state solution, it's an excuse to do nothing. And while settlements expand in the West Bank, members of Netanyahu's government are rejoicing. Knesset member Oren Hazen, I want to read this to you. Proponent expanding the settlement said, quote, "The president who will take office very soon says we should build. I called on the prime minister," this is Netanyahu, "to place brick upon brick without any fear whatsoever. After so many years of the left and the media selling us stories about isolation and friction, finally our greatest friend overseas is saying exactly the things we've been dreaming of." Trump, end quote. Trump also, of course, is promising to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, as discouraging as this may be, the biggest concern that I have for foreign policy is Trump's promise to tear up the six-party agreement with Iran. he said in March in a meeting, an APEC meeting, he said, "My number one priority is to dismantle the disastrous deal with Iran." Although Trump could refuse to lift additional sanctions, there are 5 other nations, including Russia, who signed this. It's not a bilateral U.S. agreement. Iran, meanwhile, could just say, okay, we're going to stop observing the nuclear restraints. And the danger is that the agreement collapses, that there's new pressure on the U.S. and on Israel to attack Tehran's nuclear infrastructure. This, well, I'll quote President Obama on this. At American University, he said of the Iran agreement, "Let's not mince words. The choice we face is ultimately between diplomacy and some form of war. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not 3 months from now, but soon." I fear he's right. This is the concern that should be foremost in all of our minds, because a war with Iran is in nobody's interest, and there's no such thing as surgical strikes taking out the nuclear infrastructure. That doesn't work. And one hope is that there are saner voices around him, and that Putin will sit down with him and say, hey, Russians, after all, are signatories to this. So I think that's important. Again, improved relations with Russia may be the one bright spot in Trump's foreign policy. In addition to Syria, where Trump and Putin's views seem to be in sync, Trump is much more sympathetic to Russia's policies in Ukraine. Trump has said he would recognize Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which is not about to be undone no matter who was president. Crimea became part of the Russian Empire in 1783. And in 1954, Khrushchev transferred Crimea to Ukraine, sort of a gift. Ukraine, of course, was then part of the Soviet Union. I'm afraid there's not much the international community can or should do about Russia's annexation of Ukraine. The bigger issue is eastern Ukraine, which has seen a Russian-supported insurrection against pro-Western leadership in Kiev. I believe it was a mistake. We talked about NATO earlier. I believe it was a mistake, a very big mistake, to expand NATO right up to Russia's border, which violated an agreement, a verbal agreement between Secretary of State Baker and the Russians in 1990. According to voluminous historical documents, Baker gave Russia, quote, an ironclad guarantee that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward in exchange for Russian cooperation with the reunification of Germany. Although President Poroshenko and his government would like NATO's protection extended to Ukraine, the Obama administration wisely has not favored immediate membership. I can't imagine that Trump is going to push for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, so that's something to be positive about. I think really it is in Ukraine's interest and in America's interest that Ukraine not take sides, that it remain a bridge between Europe and Russia. And I would hope that the Trump administration would not make the mistake that the Obama administration did of really forcing Ukraine to ally with the West and with Europe. And to Afghanistan, a country that has a great interest of mine and I'm passionate about. Trump will inherit America's longest war. We've been at this war for 15 years, and we're losing. 2 important provinces in Afghanistan are under siege by the Taliban. President Obama promised that he would end this war. And in fact, he sent B-52 strategic bombers back into Afghanistan, first time in a decade. He's deployed American Special Operations Forces to support the Afghan Army's ground-level fight against the Taliban. And the escalation has postponed the collapse of Afghanistan, but it will not defeat the Taliban. As a UN friend of mine says, the US policy is to keep the government of Afghanistan on life support in the hope that it doesn't collapse during my administration. So everybody keeps kicking this down the road. But I've been working on Afghanistan for about 5 years, promoting negotiations as a way to settle the war. And really, Jamie was talking about my experience in Central America. The bigger question we have, everybody agrees that our nation-building experiment in the Middle East hasn't worked. So now what? Michael Mandelbaum, who's written a book on just this issue, I asked him, I said, what do we do now? He said, well, I guess we're stuck. We're going to have to keep troops in these countries forever. These wars are endless. Well, that's not very satisfying. First of all, it's very expensive. We're spending $10 billion a year even for the reduced number of troops we have in Afghanistan. So what do? There's no talk about a surge. There's no enthusiasm for that. And I know a lot of my colleagues say, we should just leave. There's no reason to stay in Afghanistan. We may end up doing that. But I have been pushing for a serious effort to negotiate a peace settlement with the Taliban, national reconciliation, bring some of them into the government, whether it's as governors of provinces along the border. In the Afghan constitution, which everybody speaks of with hushed tones, is a terrible constitution in most places. The governorships, police chiefs, everything is controlled by the presidency. And as I said to a friend of mine, I said, they're appointed. He said, no, they're auctioned off. That's how you get a police chief position. The corruption is just truly staggering. So how can this be resolved? I think that in a way, I look at, again, the model in Central America, that the next president has to say, okay, we're going to get out of here, let all parties know, but the Taliban are not a transnational terrorist organization. They have no desire to operate outside of Afghanistan. In terms of our own security, the only interest that we have is that they don't allow transnational, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, to operate in their territory. So a deal could be made, I believe, and Obama has already withdrawn 90,000 troops and closed all but 6 of the 74 bases we have in Afghanistan. We've already spent $700 billion in Afghanistan. Just on the reconstruction, we spent $115 billion, which, according to John Sopko, who's the Inspector General for Afghanistan, that's more money than we spent in current dollars on the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. But when you go to Afghanistan, you look around and you say, well, where's the money? The place is not booming. And the money is really in Dubai, it's in Swiss bank accounts, and it's also in Bethesda. It's these consulting firms have made out like bandits, and a huge amount of money has been wasted. In some cases, 70% of the contracts are spent just on security. Then you have to pay off people in the government, and it's an absolute disaster. It's worse than Vietnam in a sense. I mean, these guys have perfected corruption. It's just unbelievable. I have to tell you a story. Right before, during one of my trips, I came back, I went to a meeting at USIP of State Department officials. And they said, we're talking about who was running for the election. One of them was a man named Mohammed Zia Massoud. Mohammed Zia Massoud, I jumped up, I said, wait a minute, this guy's a crook. And they said, what do you mean? And Carl Eichenberry, who was probably our most capable ambassador in Afghanistan, had written a memo or cable back to Washington, which was leaked. And in the cable, he pointed out that Massoud, who was Karzai's first vice president, he had a nice estate on Palm Island in Dubai. He was picked up in a joint UAE-US money laundering operation in Dubai as he arrived at the airport with $52 million worth of, quote, crisp US currency, $100 bills, in about 5 giant duffel bags. And they kept him for about 6 hours. The presidential palace in Kabul called Washington and said, yeah, let him out, he's our vice president. So ultimately they did. They let him out. And they allowed him to not only keep the 52 million, but he kept his job. And I said to the State Department, I said, well, guys, no wonder nobody supports your policy over there. These guys are crooks. You've surrounded yourself with crooks and warlords and drug dealers. And he says, Bill, we're not dealing with the founding fathers here. Then another one said, well, Karzai said it was an exaggeration. First of all, they said he wasn't convicted, so it was unfair to pillory him like this. Then another, Karzai said, well, it was only 2 million. And I said, well, suppose Joe Biden showed up in Ottawa with 2 million in crisp US currency. And he said, do you think he would keep his job or the money? And he said, well, you go with what you got. Okay, fast forward. The election happens. This guy ends up not running, or at least not placing. Fast forward. There's a big debate over who will be in the government. They could not agree on a single, we have a sort of a power sharing arrangement between Ghani and Abdullah, who finished second, and threatened a coup if he wasn't included. And John Kerry cut this sort of deal which guarantees a dysfunctional government. They couldn't agree on any ministers. And to this day, they still don't have a defense minister. But they did agree on one person, the director of the government office of good governance. As the New York Times put it, quote, in charge of rooting out corruption. And who is that man? Mr. Mohammed Zia Massoud. It's absolutely surreal. And it's no wonder our policies are not succeeding. Okay, what do? The Pakistanis are very tired of supporting this. They have 2.5 million Afghan refugees. They've got their own Taliban terrorist cells that are making their lives difficult. So they have an interest in ending this war. And the Chinese are new players. Chinese made a $3 billion investment it's the largest foreign investment ever made in Afghanistan in a huge copper mine. But it's useless to them now because of the lack of security. Pakistan and China are closely allied. China's a major arms supplier, a major ally, and the Chinese want a settlement. And obviously the Americans want out of this thing. I have been arguing that if the United States gets serious, right now the idea of negotiations is the Taliban negotiate the terms of their defeat and they surrender. That's the idea. I think you've got to go much farther. Remember Jim Dobbins, who was formerly the special rep for Afghanistan and Pakistan. I said, what about negotiations? He says, well, the Taliban know our terms. Accept the Constitution and integrate into the government. Well, given their battlefield supremacy, that's not about to happen. There has to be a real power sharing arrangement. There has to be a settlement that allows them either a couple of cabinet positions or a number of governorships. I mean, that I think is the only way to settle this. I mean, there's been 4 meetings between the Taliban and the government so far this year with China, the U.S., and of course Pakistan in attendance. The former head of the Mullah Mansour was in a taxi coming back from Iran, and he and his taxi driver in Pakistan were taken out by a drone. Well, this, as you can imagine, has delayed the negotiations. Nevertheless, I think ultimately the Taliban will return to the negotiating table. Trump will, as he comes into office, will have 3 options dealing with Pakistan, given 4 if you want to talk about a third, but that's not going to happen, dealing with Afghanistan. He'll have 3 options. First would be to continue the politically expedient policy of the Obama administration, which is keeping the country on life support. The second would be just pulling out, and I don't think that Trump wants to be charged with losing Afghanistan. As Carl says, he wants to be a winner, and he wants to win, win, win. That would certainly not look good. So that, I think, option is off the table, which leaves a negotiated political settlement as really the only real option for the United States. And Again, it depends on who's in as Secretary of State and who, in particular, is running our Afghan-Pakistan policy. But I just think that that's really, again, the way forward. Now, to the Western Hemisphere, we've had some discussion of this earlier. Trump has talked about rolling back two policies. One is normalization of relations with Cuba, something Mark and I, a number of us, have worked on. I think it's one of the three signature accomplishments of the Obama administration, very important. Now, Trump said, initially he said he had no problem with it. I mean, he's a hotel guy after all, and why not? And if any of you have been to Cuba lately, it's like going to Disney World almost. The place is absolutely overrun with American tourists. Trump then, in an effort to court South Florida's Cuban-American community, reversed himself, said he would halt further concessions to Cuba, whatever that means, and even take a few back. Robert Muse, a colleague of ours at the Center for International Policy and an international lawyer, who really is I would say, the Washington's and maybe America's leading expert on the structure of the embargo, told the Miami Herald, and I think this is very wise. He said, the weakness of executive branch action, again, Obama did most of this without going to Congress because he couldn't make any progress. So most of the openings to Cuba have been done with executive orders. The weakness of executive branch action is that what one president does, another can easily undo. Trump can rescind the executive orders, but I think it's unlikely he would do a wholesale repeal of Obama's executive actions. It's a bigger decision than it might appear. Close to 1 million tourists, American tourists, will visit Cuba this year. Major US airlines are flying into Cuba, into cities all over Cuba. You know, go to Cuba and get frequent flyer miles, which is really a change. Both Sheraton and Marriott are opening up hotels. Cuba is Airbnb's biggest market. There is simply no public support for resuming hostilities with Cuba. I think that, for the millions of people who have visited Cuba over the years, Americans particularly, I think throwing up an embargo in Cuba and going after Cuba is sort of like embargoing Bermuda. It just doesn't make any sense. And I could really imagine Trump looking at Cuba and saying, wow, I want a piece of this, and trying to get his own hotel properties there. Mexico is also on Trump's hit list. Last night, he said, on 60 Minutes interview, planned to immediately deport 2 or 3 million undocumented immigrants, not all Mexicans, of course, who have criminal records after his inauguration in January. The number is down from an initial election and force Mexico to pay for it. Well, I think that's been downgraded to offense, and which I suspect we can afford ourselves. I don't think the Mexicans are going to pay for that either. Abe Lowenthal, who many of you know, sort of a mainstream figure. He's one of the founders of the founder of the In-American Dialogue, said it this way. He said, the importance of Mexico for the US economy and of cooperation with Mexico on many domestic issues, as well as policies that foster a reintegration of Cuba into the North American region, will probably become evident to President-elect Trump and his advisors, and the political advantages to the Republican Party of maintaining these approaches will also become clear. So, again, as Carl said, Trump 3.0, I think, is less likely to make unnecessary trouble in something like this. And he's already won Florida, and the Cuban-American vote in Florida was absolutely split, as it has been for the last couple of years, right down the middle, half for Trump and half for Clinton. Cuba does not have the resonance among the Cuban-American community that it once had, and that's demographics. The old hardline Cuban Americans are dying off, and even in Cuba, the old hardliners are dying off. And so I think that the new generation does not have a dog in that fight. Finally, the big test that awaits Trump is how to resolve inevitable disputes with a rapidly ascending China, determined to take what it considers its rightful place in the world stage. Graham Allison at Harvard published an article last year entitled The Thucydides' trip. You can see I didn't take a lot of Greek when I was in school. Now, the US and China headed for war. 2,400 years ago, Greek philosopher Thucydides argued that the rise of Athens made war with Sparta inevitable. Sparta was the dominant power, and Athens' rise challenged the status quo and Sparta's dominance. In the same way, China's rise is challenging America's century-long economic and military hegemony. China is much, much more important in the long term than Russia. Russia, it has a tiny economy, it's got a lot of missiles, it's a player, and Putin has sort of made it a player in Europe. But in the long run, the much, much bigger issue is how we deal with China. It's very dangerous. And how the Trump administration and the leaders of China handle this tectonic shift in military and economic power will, to a larger degree, determine the fate of the Earth, I think. War between these two nuclear-armed superpowers is too horrible to contemplate. Yet, Graham Allison argues, based on the current trajectory, war between the United States and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, but much more likely than recognized by at the moment. Indeed, judging by the historical record, Allison says, war is more likely than not. He warns that avoiding a war with China, quote, will mean more radical changes in attitudes and actions by leaders and publics alike than anyone has yet imagined. And he wrote this, of course, without ever imagining that someone like Donald Trump would become president of the United States. The task before us then, all of us, is to build a popular movement that is pragmatic, not just idealistic. Citizens will support diplomacy only if we believe that it works, that it will keep them safe. We must thoroughly discredit the idea that spending more on the military will make Americans safer here at home, for in fact, the opposite is true. We must convince the king of deal-making that only imaginative, robust diplomacy can protect Americans at home and abroad. We have our work cut out for us. Thank you. I hope I haven't depressed you too much, because on the foreign policy issue, and I'm glad we're not dealing with domestic issues, because there's nothing positive to be said about a Trump presidency. But on foreign policy issues, again, as Jamie said, I've been at this for a long, long time, and one has to be optimistic. And I think in the long run, we're all going to be dead. But there's work to be done. I think that there's some reason for optimism. And Trump, I have a friend, some of you know, a little loopy, Caleb Rossiter, who before the election said, I hope Trump wins this mindset. I, again, think that's absolutely crazy, but for the most part, I think it's an uncharted territory. Nobody knows where we're going to go, but there's some reason for optimism. And the biggest reason is that Trump, unlike, say, 1972, 73, Trump has no mandate. He lost the popular vote, and the country is incredibly mobilized. So I think there's lots of reasons to
Bush had
be
no
optimistic.
mandate in 2000, and yet...
How's that?
Bush had no mandate in 2000, and yet...
And he was going nowhere until 9/11. 9/11 is what saved Bush presidency, in a sense. He was talking about, we're not going to do nation building. I think 9/11 is what